afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Audrey Lau, and I am the Adult and Senior Services Specialist with the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. With me today are my lovely co-hosts, Tiana Davis and Kyla Hennington, with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. Since the summer of 2024, the library system and the Office of Human Rights have been hosting lunch and learns on Tuesday, featuring, among many, NASA scientists and astronauts, graphic novelists, historians, judges, doctors, multimedia artists, and more. We love bringing you, our viewers, such an incredible range of speakers with whom to engage and from whom to learn, and are so appreciative. We are so appreciative of all of our guests and the time that they spent with us. Today, it is our and my great pleasure to welcome in conversation Dr. Philip Deloria. There may be a little bit of geeking out over here, but we'll try to keep it to a minimum. Dr. Deloria, who is of Dakota descent, is the Leverett Saltonstall Professor of History at Harvard University, where his research and teaching focus on the social, cultural, and political histories of the relations among American Indian peoples and the United States. He is the author of several books, including Indians in Unexpected Places, American Studies, A User's Guide with Alexander Olson, and Becoming Mary Sully, Toward an American Indian Abstract, as well as 2 co-edited books and numerous articles and chapters. Dr. Deloria received his Ph.D. in American Studies from Yale University in 1994, taught at the University of Colorado, and then, I'm losing my place, from 2001 to 2017 at the University of Michigan before joining the Harvard faculty in January 2018. Deloria was a long-serving trustee of our own Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian. He is former president of the American Studies Association, the Organization of American Historians, and the Society for American History, an elected member of the American Philosophical Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the recipient of numerous prizes and recognitions. Welcome, Dr. Deloria.
Thank you so much for having me.
To get us started, could you take a few minutes and just introduce folks to your work, broadly speaking, or specifically, however you choose?
So I'm an American Studies person, sort of at heart, which means that I'm really interested in the United States in all of its messiness and complexity and diversity, both in a domestic continental kind of way, but also as it exists within a global kind of world. So that's half of my life. And the other half is sort of being really tied to and interested in Native American and indigenous studies. So thinking a bit about sort of the Native peoples, not only of this continent, but of the rest of the world. I've had wonderful sort of, engagements with colleagues in Australia, in New Zealand, in Taiwan, other places. So I've been thinking a lot about sort of indigeneity in a global kind of sense. So, kind of putting those things together has sort of created this sort of thread of scholarship. As you mentioned, Audrey, my first book, Playing Indian, is about non-Native people who dress up like Indians. And if we think about this in American history, the Boston Tea Party, various fraternal orders, Campfire Girls and Boy Scouts, New Age hippies, et cetera, I tried to argue was a big, long, theme across American history. And that then led me to a second book, which was really very much kind of come out of some of my own family history. It's a set of essays. The first one is about my grandfather, who was an All-American honorable mention athlete in the 1920s as a football player. And thinking a bit about sort of the ways that people know one Indian athlete, that is to say Jim Thorpe, but in fact, there were lots and lots. So it's about Indian people doing stuff that nobody expects. And that has pushed me sort of thinking about modernism and what modernity might be and how Native people live within and against that. And that's pushed me sort of really to my third book, which is about my great aunt, Mary Sully, and who has been the subject of, a couple of wonderful exhibitions, including at the Met and right now at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And so those are the places that I've kind of been intellectually, and, happy to sort of chat more about them, but that's me.
Okay, so we have at least 2 classrooms of of students that watch our program. So one of the things I just like to clarify is for them is the difference between an American Studies um, program and maybe like a straightforward American history program.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so, you know, American Studies is always framed as being the sort of the interdisciplinary meeting of history on the one hand and literature on the other. So our literary studies, friends and colleagues, give me a novel, give me a paragraph, let me dig into it, let me get into the text, and then from that text, let me make some big claims about, how the literature is working and how it's functioning. Our historian friends and colleagues, like, give me context, let me understand all the ins and outs and the complexities of these kinds of things. So what American Studies does is kind of pulls together those modes of reading. We always start with a text. This is how I always do it, right? We start with a text. We work our interpretive magic. We try to figure out what that text means. We put that text in dialogue with other texts that are like it. This is the secret sauce of American Studies. Right? We create these sort of genres in which people are saying really, really similar things across different sort of forums and different sort of medias. So what does it mean that they're saying the same things? It means that there's some kind of cultural thing happening, right? That gets packaged up in a whole bunch of different ways. And then from that, we sort of ask, well, and what are the mechanisms through which those things are said, right? The institutions, the structures, following the money, right? And then from that, we sort of ask, well, how do we theorize this? Like, how does power work in this? How are some people advantaged and other people disadvantaged? How are these things working to get us to act against our own interests, for example? So American Studies has this really interesting, I think, kind of vertical structure, but I don't want to sort of act as if it's hierarchical. You can jump in at the level of theory and find a text. You can find a text and sort of move to theorize. You can be curious about a particular moment or an institution. So it's this very, very fluid kind of mode of analysis, as opposed to sort of, I'm in the history department right now, where history is a little bit less on the, a little bit less willing to go to the sort of literary side where we might imagine, I don't want to say history is not creative because it's super creative, but we focus on archives, and our archives tend to be a little more constricted, perhaps. And we focus a lot on contextualization, and we put ourselves into a historian's kind of collection of historiographies, the things that people have written. So an American Studies person can move easily into a history department, as I've done throughout my career. And a historian can oftentimes move into an American Studies kind of context, especially if they're interested in questions of culture. So I guess that'd be the bottom line, right? I mean, American Studies person is really interested in culture, how we make meaning, how we communicate meaning, how we think about it, whereas historians can be political historians, economic historians, legal historians. They can have all kinds of other sort of boundaries with other sort of fields and disciplines. And the American Studies world is really sort of a cultural world. So that's how I see it. That's how I think about it.
That's really helpful. So my first contact with your work was actually back in spring of 2007. And I know this because I marked it on my book. So it was the last semester of graduate school, and Dr. Nancy Burkaw, who is now the deputy director for the Center for Restorative History at the Smithsonian, assigned us Indians in Unexpected Places, which is this book here. Which is not easy to see. So when Kyla asked if, for people I'd like to, my dream people to invite to Lunch and Learn, I actually brought your name up. And after reading Playing Indian for this program, I know representations of Native Americans in 19th and 20th century has always been your jam. But Indians in Unexpected Places forced me to confront head on, like what I saw, what I thought, and what I needed to learn in a really visceral way. There was also a playfulness to it, which is not something you often get with history books. And the class discussion on this book was just riotous. I'd not experienced it ever again. And so I guess my question, getting to this question, and I can show any pictures that you'd like, but what was your goal for this book? Like, how did people respond to it? I've always wondered what came first, the photographs or the idea? So.
That's a great question. Well, some part of it was the photographs, right? So, for folks who are out there listening, right, there's a photograph of an Indian woman in a beautiful sort of buckskin dress sitting under a hairdryer getting her fingernails done, right? And I used to take this photo and other photos like it, and I'd sort of show them to audiences, and people would laugh. And I'd say, why are you laughing? Like, what's so funny? And like, well, it just doesn't, right? So unexpectedness was sort of always lurking there as a conceptual kind of idea. But I also had these moments in my classes where students would say, like, I don't know if people remember this, that's a stereotype, that's biased. And then they would like give me a reward because I just like did something, analytical. And I'd be like, that's not really very smart, right? Like, we can do better. To name something as a stereotype is just not that helpful. And I'm not going to give you a pellet, because you've sort of said that. But then I thought, well, what am I actually giving them as tools? And so unexpectedness and expectedness became my way to try to kind of frame for students, really, the complexities around concepts like ideology and discourse. And so the book begins with this fairly theoretical, it begins with that picture in which I invite audiences to laugh, tell them not to laugh, and then tell them why they should not laugh, right? And how they should think about these things. So to think about the ways that ideology sort of like creates cultural formations that are unbalanced, that advantage some people and disadvantage other people, the ways that discourses sort of get inside our heads and limit what we can think and say, and how those two things fit together. And that was all a notion of expectedness, right? A way of giving students some tools to think about these more complicated kinds of issues in a language. And what's been really fun to me is people have adopted this language a lot. They're like, such and such in unexpected places. And it becomes a sort of a trope, people sort of think about it. So that was one part of it. But the other part of it was, Playing Indian is about white Americans. There's not very many Native people in there. There's really two kind of moments in two chapters where Native people show up. And I really wanted to do more material history of Native people, and so thinking about like, okay, well, where are the places where Native people show up and people chuckle because they're doing things that nobody expects them to do? And so the early 20th century ends up being this place. And originally I thought about doing it as a course, and I collected all kinds of interestingly quirky stories, many of which didn't make it into the book, right? So there's a famous Pawnee roller skating champion from the early 20th century. They used to do these things where people would go sit on poles for, days and days and days, and audiences would come. There was an Indian pole sitter, things like that. So odd stuff. But in the end, I really did, as I mentioned before, sort of take my cue from my grandfather. So here's a third sort of moment of the sort of this coming together. And for me, it was a very really important moment. My grandfather had Alzheimer's. I visited him shortly before he passed. And, we couldn't really have a conversation, but he had said like, well, who are you? Where are you from? And I said, well, I'm your grandson, and I'm coming to you from Connecticut, where I was in grad school at the time. And he immediately went into this football memory. He's like, I remember the Connecticut Aggies and beating them, and I threw this pass, and it was like, I'd always thought of my grandfather as being this kind of Native informant for anthropologists. He was a traditional, 19th century language speaker. He knew a lot of old words, but and he was a minister, so very committed to the church over the course of his life. But I realized in that moment, there's something I hadn't really understood, which was that he saw himself as an athlete. That was his sort of inner core. And people who do Alzheimer's are like, no, it was a random memory. I'm like, I actually don't think it was a random memory. I think it was like, this is his essence. And then I remembered all these moments of his incredible physicality. For me as a kid, how is it that your grandfather is out there sort of holding his own with you as a teenager, throwing the football and throwing the baseball around? It's like, he was a super physical guy. And then as I sort of explored his story, what I realized, he was an example of an Indian person in an unexpected place, right? That people had named Jim Thorpe as like the one Indian athlete that they know. They named that as the exception, which proved the rule. And the rule was Indian people were not participating in sports, when in fact, Native people were doing sports all the time. They were able to cross the color line, right? And in ways that African-American athletes were not. And then from that, I pursued a set of other interests, right? So I've always been a musician. How is it that you can go da 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 and like picture of Indians riding across how is it like 3 or 4 notes in a rhythm can actually create that thing? Where did that sound of Indian come from? It's interested in that. Really interested in Wild West show performers who are traveling all over the world and becoming very cosmopolitan, interested in Indian cars and Indian people driving cars. So it's a whole series of these essays and explorations of how Indian people are doing stuff. Yeah.
I
So
love this.
look at this picture and they laugh, right? And it's like, actually in the West, Indian people bought a lot of cars, right? Whenever they had disposable money. And why? Because it made a total cultural kind of sense to them, right? I've control. It's more like a horse than a train. You know, I've control over what I do. I drive around. This is, of course, the experience of many, many people of color who, you know, kind of when cars become available, mobility is a kind of a key to a sense of liberty and freedom, you know? So there's this sort of series of essays. And at the very end, you know, of the book, I was really hoping that all these really interesting Native people in the early 20th century were like meeting up and having dinner together. You know, it's like, hey, I'm going to be in LA next week. Let's, you know, and I just didn't really, the historical evidence did not really suggest that, right? So I ended up with this argument about them being a cohort of people. That is to say, they were passing through very similar things, engaging American modernity, you know, in similar kinds of ways. And every now and then they crossed paths, but by and large, they were you know, operating independently, which in some ways is actually a stronger argument, a more interesting argument, right? Lots of people doing diverse kinds of things in the same context, as opposed to a small group that was talking to each other and planning, you know, things like that. So the concept, the personal stories, the text, they all were sort of swirling around, you know, together. And I have to credit the editor of this book, Nancy Jackson, who sort of said, oh, that sounds like an interesting class. I think it could be a book. And I hadn't really thought of it as a book until she told me that it was. And she was right.
That's really great. That's really great. So you talk about a lot of your work being grounded in some visual art, photography, representations of Native peoples and history and culture. What kind of challenges do you find that kind of source material presents, like reading it, unpacking it, and understanding it?
Yeah, well, one of the things that's interesting to me is what our method is, right? How we actually interpret things. And when I first started my teaching career at the University of Colorado, you know, I was teaching an advanced research seminar, which I had no business teaching, really. You know, as a first-year assistant professor, I should not have been teaching it probably. But I realized, you know, these students don't actually have a real sense of what their method is, about how they go about doing things. And I voiced this to someone who said, all right, smart guy, you teach the methods class if you think like you. And then I realized, like, I actually didn't really have a very good sense of what method was either. You know, was it like a school of thought? If you were a feminist scholar, was that a method? Was it a sort of set of skills you took into an archive that you had to wear white gloves, which we don't do anymore, but they did back then? And, you know, was it, you know, techniques? What was method, you know? And thinking about how art and images and representations are read was sort of my gateway into thinking about that. And what I ended up doing was a kind of an interesting, complicated thing. I had taken a course in graduate school from Jules Prown, who was sort of a person who was willing to talk about method and interpretation and how you do it, and in a very systematic way. Do this, do this, do this, do this. And he laid it all out. And what he was doing was reverse engineering. Well, he was engineering art historical method into material culture, right? Which then I found myself reverse engineering back through the course of my whole career, reverse engineering Jules Prown's material culture stuff back into thinking about reading art and representation. And, you know, basically, I mean, not to sort of dwell on this, but, you know, here's how it works, you know, for me, and I think, you know, Prown would agree, you know, you defamiliarize yourself from the thing. Like if you look at it and you think you know what it is, you're going to miss stuff. So you got to make it strange, right? And this is what literary critics would tell us also, right? Make it strange, make it weird. You never seen it before. You know, you don't know what it is. Humility for me is like one of the most important kind of aspects we can bring to this. And then like you slow down and you just describe it, right? You let your empirical, perceptual kind of self, you describe it in huge detail, great detail. And this is where the art historical method, are there planes, are there angles, what's the perspective, all of those kinds of things, right? And doing it with material culture, I think, really encourages you to slow up and make really good descriptions. And then you make deductions about it, right? Which is to say, like, there are a couple of general rules that we all agree upon that are floating around out here, and I'm going to apply that rule to this particular case. So you're making two different kinds of fact, right? The first is the fact of the senses. Here's what I see. Second is the fact of the mind. Here's how I'm making deductions about this, right? And then you let yourself be creative, right? Then you speculate about stuff. You adopt a tentative language. Well, what if? And you let yourself, but you're always controlled by what you've seen and what you've deduced, right? You can't go crazy, but you can speculate. And those speculations then turn into questions, which can then be researched. And there's a step-by-step kind of method for how you engage these kinds of things. And I've used this right over the course of my career. I've taught it, for forever. It's why my version of American Studies method almost always starts with a text rather than starting with a theory, right? I just start in a very grounded kind of way with, a picture, a photograph, a letter, those kinds of things. And that's where the thrill is and the joy, right, is finding something in a source that nobody's really seen before, right? Or that you can't even anticipate it. I mean, it is so fun, right? It's just fun. It's a fun thing to do. And this is what everybody does. All thinking people, right, who engage stuff. I mean, we can all go on TikTok or Instagram and find lots and lots of people who are doing very similar things, making sense of small texts and making big claims about them.
And I think that's what, is the difference between history. One of the questions we have here is, why do we always have to have history classes? I want to learn about the future. Young people, and the way that they've been introduced to history is often through a book. It's really boring, and it's dates and names, and there's very little connection with, okay, why do we study the, like your book, Playing Indian, really made me think about, I have never questioned really seriously beyond the fact that people dressed up and as Native Americans and got on a boat and threw tea into the harbor. It never occurred to me to be like, well, why did they do that? It was just something that happened. And that's as far as our history classes go in school. At least this happened, it happened on a date. And that's as far as it went. And, what I would love to let you all know in the audience is when I say history is fun, it's fun because I've had teachers like Dr. Deloria who have brought out things and stuff and said, what do you think of this? Football tickets that happen to have a plethora of players across time. We don't think about football as having a history, but it does. And it's really cool to that's how I started history. I had professors and teachers who showed us different interpretations of maps of the New World, and and then came and did you know there were thousands of people there already? It's not blank, but these maps would have you think that there are no cities and states. So what is your kind of answer to this young person saying, I want to learn about the history. Why do we have to do history? I want to learn more about the future.
I'm so sympathetic to this question, and I think it's because there's history and then there's history, right? And too often the way that history gets taught is sort of, the archive questions, right? Who, where, what, when, right? Name this date, this event, this person, right? When the really interesting questions are the how and the why questions, right? So we got to know, we got to ask the little questions, right? Who, where, when, who, what, where, when questions in order to get to the how and the why questions. The how and the why questions challenge our minds to think about how stuff worked, not just in the past, but in the present. Because I think one of the things that we want as human beings in the present is, how do we get leverage on where we're at? How do we understand the world that we're in order to understand where we might go? So different disciplines will claim different ways of doing it. So for example, right now, lots of students want to study economics, right? And I think they do that because economics gives them a kind of a toolkit, right? Here's a tool, plug in some data and you can make sense of the world. You can get leverage on the world. That's a free rider problem. That's a this problem, right? I mean, so how do you get leverage on the world? If you don't have leverage on the present, right, then you can never have leverage on the future. You can never quite figure out what's happening in the future. I think history is one of the best ways to get leverage on the present. right? To look at the past and to see what people did and to sort of try to imagine them, right? This is an act, history is fundamentally an act of the imagination, right? I mean, we always sort of think like, oh, the people of the past, they're just like us. They just wear funny clothes and weird hats and stuff like that. It's like, not true. They're totally different. They're super weird. I mean, they're weird. So you can sort of say like, I want to imagine the future through science fiction, but you can also sort of say, I want to imagine different weird people by going to the past. And you can totally find them because they're all over the place. Everybody is a little weird. They're not like us. So how did we get to the place we're at right now from these people who were so weird and odd and different? Can we understand them? And this is where I think history is just really important, because on the one hand, there's the specificity of the weirdness of those people. On the other hand, there's the kind of universality of us being human and having certain human things in common with those people. And that's a really hard and interesting question to navigate. And history demands that we do that. It's very easy to look at the people of the past and not have sympathy for them. Like, that was an evil person who did super bad things. Oftentimes that's true, but they were different and they were weird, right? And if we actually are willing to give some sympathy, some empathy to our historical subjects across this sort of past, but that's, this line between them and us, we become better thinking people, right? And we actually, I think, become better human beings, frankly, right? You look in the mirror, or you should, if you look in the mirror and you think to yourself like, oh, am I a simple person? No, like, I'm a super complicated person. Like, sometimes I do bad stuff when I don't mean to. Sometimes I do inexplicably good things when I had no intention of doing that, right? I'm complicated, right? We're all complicated. And the people of the past were complicated like that too. And when we put ourselves together in groups, how much more complicated do we get? So the past is a great place to go and think through those questions as a way of thinking about how we are now in order to move forward.
Kind of a follow-up to that. Do you have tips for people on how they can not just get interested in history, but really study it and learn about the past? And, I say that as, historical stuff is being erased currently, and not even just politically. Like, I think, was it HBO Max? They wiped out all of Cartoon Network's like animated shows, so they just aren't available anymore. Which is sort of history being erased, right? So what are your tips?
Well, I think one thing that's really helpful to me, as a person who wants to pursue history, there's some things that I just don't really care that much about, and I don't pursue them. But there's other things I'm very, very passionate about. And, for those things, sort of asking, what are the threads that connect up the past and the present? Those things end up being really important. So I care a lot about music, which means I'm actually going to sort of like look for primary sources in music. That is to say, stuff that's out there. I'm going to look for secondary sources in music. That is to say, stuff that historians have written about. And, if you get overbalanced in one way or another, you need both of those things together, right? You want to be in dialogue with other people who are thinking, right? Other people who are writing books and articles and things like that. But you also want to be in direct dialogue with the past itself, right? So I want to listen to something from the past, whether that's a 19th century song that doesn't really make all that much sense to me, whether it's a piece of early 20th century classical music that used 12-tone composition, right? I want to be in dialogue with the primary sources, and I want to see be part of a community of scholars. And I think sort of figuring out the balance of those things. I would also say one other thing that's really, I've found really important is just the place-based nature of history, of being in a place in which something has happened. And, I don't want to get all metaphysical about it, but like, there are places in this world where you can feel things, right? And maybe it's a place where something really, really bad has happened and there's still something in that place, right? Or maybe it's a place where something really momentous has happened and you feel like you're there, and it challenges your imagination. But I think there's also a kind of worlding kind of connection that you can make, in places. Some of the most powerful experiences I've ever had have been going to historical places and trying to sort of think and put myself in those places, trying to embody myself in that past. And, you kind of have to know a bit about the place in order to actually make that work, right? You can't just walk over to a, monument or a memorial or something like that and expect the magic to happen. But if you know something about what's happened in that place, right, I think you can have certain kinds of experiences that I find very compelling and very desirable. I like to have those experiences, even when they're challenging and hard.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to just pivot a little bit. I want to go back to Plain Indian. And as I was reading it, it was interesting for me reading it post January 6th, or maybe put it another way, to think about January 6th in the context of the first section of this book in particular. And so I'm not, I wasn't born here. So I actually didn't know that the Tea Party people dressed up as Indigenous folks, but I got to know that. That was all new to me in reading this book, actually. So even though I have a degree in history, it wasn't American history. So, but then thinking about this, and I can't remember, I'm so sorry, I don't remember the guy's name, but he was nicknamed like a shaman, like a January 6th shaman. And so for those people who are watching who have no idea what I'm talking about, could you just give us a little bit of what is it with white Americans for since before the United States was even a thing, taking on indigeneity as an act of rebellion? Can you just talk, including up to as recently as January 6th?
Yeah, I mean, that January 6th guy, the QAnon shaman, right, who had a big, kind of imagined buffalo horn shaman headdress and his face all painted and things like that, right? Who was claiming the right to do two things, right? One was sort of a patriotic kind of claim, right? But the second was social disorder, right? To break the law, to go on the far side of the law, to actually do something. And that's what the American Revolution is about, right? Is actually sort of getting to the far side of the law. So one of the things I was really interested in that book was starting with the Boston Tea Party and these sort of moments when colonists first start to imagine themselves just a little differently, right? So one of the things we think about with the American Revolution is these guys are loyal to the king, loyal to the king, loyal to the king, loyal to the king. Boom, revolution, no longer loyal to the king. How did that happen? Right? How did they break the bonds? And so part of the argument is they did it through the imagination and through cultural kinds of things, right? It wasn't all this political theorizing and stuff. Yeah, great, important. But they had these cultural rituals that were so important to them. And they carried those rituals over from Europe. And those rituals were rituals of things they called misrule, right? Which is we're going to throw the social order upside down for 24 hours. They will all come back together, right? So they dress up like women. They would put black in their faces. They would do things like the charivari. They would, kind of have horns and bang tin pots and things like that, and tar and feather people, and do these take a donkey into the church, right? And so they had all these sort of things that they would do to sort of put themselves on the far side of social order. I'm breaking the law. It might be temporary. It's dark. I'm wearing a mask. I'm in a group. Nobody knows who I am. We're going to go for it, right? That kind of, so there's an emotional power to that. So what happens is these colonists take these rituals and they sit there on the Atlantic seaboard and they start to imagine themselves in new ways. And so I always think of it like this, you're sitting there, you're facing west, right? You're sitting there in, Prince George's County, and you're facing west, and you're looking at, and you're seeing all these Indians, and you think of them as savages, and you are very civilized, and it helps you sort of imagine yourself, right, as in a civilized kind of way. So what happens in the moments of rebellion leading up to revolution? Imagine now that same settler is facing east and looking across at Great Britain, looking at the king and saying I can't believe they're taxing us without representation. And they send their soldiers and they make the soldiers throw us out of our houses, and all of these awful things that the king is doing. And instead now of looking over your shoulder and seeing nothing but savages, you start to see these Aboriginal people, they're of the continent, right? They get to hunt whatever they want. Their diet makes them different. Everything about them is different. Oh, damn, that's us. That's us relative to the king. We're no longer like that. And so it's this moment of Americans kind of claiming themselves to be American on the continent sort of for the first time. And how do they do it? They take all these rituals and they fill them up with content. And the content is Indian, right? Aboriginal, indigenous, We are the original people of this land. That's the argument that they're making when they're dressing up like Indians. So they say they're doing it, and they do it, and they make these things very, very powerful. And they take all these different forms in different places. So New England is different from Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. But people are doing it all across the Atlantic seaboard in the years leading up to the revolution. They're claiming a kind of American identity. But part of the argument of the book is like, yeah, but it's a contradictory identity, right? Because you can't actually be Indians because you're killing Indians, right, in order to take this land. So one of the things I wanted to tell people in the book is that, like, you know, we wonder why Americans are never quite settled in a sort of national identity. This is why. It's about settler colonialism, if we're going to actually use a theoretical kind of word, right? Kill the Indian in order to become the Indian, right? Become the Indian in order to kill the Indian, right? Take native land in order to claim a kind of aboriginality, right, to yourself. Erase Indians and contain them so that you can actually become Indian, make this kind of claim to be Aboriginal in relation to, right, the old world, while at the same time claiming to be civilized, advanced, all of those kinds of things right together. So it's this incredibly utilitarian thing in a cultural kind of way, right? Super evocative and really powerful. And so then the rest of the book says, okay, if this was so powerful and evocative, then don't Americans keep doing it? And the answer is like, yeah, they do, right? It's the itch that they can't keep from scratching. So you get all of these other episodes across time. So that's the sort of argument of the book. And that's why I think, like, you can go all the way up to the present moment, you know, to the QAnon shaman, and sort of find the same kind of practice going on.
Yeah, it was, I mean, very interesting. And again, looking at it. And so back to the question about why learn history for students. And I understand that question. I did my undergraduate degree in history because I loved my professor, Dr. Gordon Hack, best professor ever, aside from Dr. Deloria, I'm sure. But it was, it really is. It's because when you understand history, you can see the present in such a new and rich way.
Mm-hmm.
We do have a comment here. I'm going to test you on your poetry. We Wear the Mask by Paul Lawrence Dunbar, which I can read very quickly. I have it up on my screen if we need to see it. Is this poem a reflection of American history? Are you familiar with this poem, Dr. Deloria?
This poem is somewhere dimly in my consciousness, but I've never sort of like engaged it, deeply as a text. But
okay, I'm going to put it in the chat for viewers to watch and think about. Maybe I'll do that. That, and maybe we can. Maybe that's a question for our viewers to read it and think about it as they study it in the context of this conversation. I just put it in the chat for people who are watching. Can we talk about Mary Sully for a little bit? We are so excited. Audrey, do you want to just jump in? And you got the book. You can show some pictures. And I want to hand it over to Audrey here.
Well, you don't have to, but I just got so excited about this. Reading and everything, but I think this is my favorite. But can you talk about when you discovered Mary Sully? Did you immediately see all these connections when you first saw these pieces of art? And how did you get from this artwork in a box that your mom showed you to this exhibit and catalog? And what are your favorite parts of this process? Because I got to tell you, I showed this to a coworker this morning. It's just like, this is what we're doing for Lunch Learn. She was excited. These images are fantastic. This is the book I'm talking about. It's kind of like to me, it's an exhibit catalog. But I will just show my absolute favorite. But you have these just beautiful, and pencil and paper. I mean, it's just beautiful. Where's the image? The one that I really liked was this first one. And it's those of you at home, this is called a triptych, which means it has 3 different images. It's kind of hard to see all at once, but go ahead. I know this is a passion project for you. It's family related. Just tell us all about it.
Yeah. Well, if we went to the dark past, the dim past of the 70s. Right? So, when I was a kid, sort of 15, 16, right, we got this box that was sent by my grandfather to our house, and it was full of these weird images, right? I mean, people had passed are weird, right? And here we are. So my grandfather didn't know quite what to do with these. They had been drawn by my great aunt. Her name was Susan Deloria, but she used the name Mary Sully as a sort of artist's name. And each one was the name of a person. It was a personality. They all had names attached to them. And some of them were personalities that we could figure out. You know, Henry Ford, who created Ford Motor Company, or J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, or Bing Crosby, the singer. But a lot of them were people that none of us had ever heard of, right? We didn't know anything about it. And so, you know, my mom, who was a librarian, multi-generation library, my grandmother also a librarian, head of the children's library at the Davenport Public Library for many years. My mom was like, well, we're going to save this and we're going to sort of think a bit about it. And, my mom put it away for a long time. My dad wasn't a great fan of it. So after my dad passed in 2005, my mom and I pulled it back out again and we started looking at it. And I thought, wow, I'd always liked these. I thought they were interesting and kind of cool. But I never really made much sense of them. But in 2005, you could do something you couldn't do in 1973 or 4 or 5, whenever that was. You could actually sit there with a laptop and start Googling people. And what I realized was in the top panel of these triptychs, right, there's as Audrey said, there's a collection of 3, in each. You could sort of understand that these were abstract kind of things, but the more you knew about the person, the more they actually came to represent the person. So hard to know what that was, that thing, but once you know that character, George Ade, had a kind of an estate in Indiana, and it had luxurious gardens to it, and he opened the gardens up and people would wander through and there were paths. Suddenly you realize like you're not looking at an abstract figure, but you're looking at a kind of an abstract representation. And then that the other 2 panels sort of unfold, from that. So the journey from the box was basically, I showed it to some friends. I did a short little paper at it on an academic conference. I had, art historians and curators who were like, that was kind of cool. And then I did go to my curator friends, my museum curator friends, and I said, so completely naively, I said, I got this super cool stuff from my half crazy great aunt it was in a box in the basement, and we should do a show. And they were like, yeah, we don't really do that. Like lots of people come to us with boxes of the art of their half crazy great aunt that they found in the basement. And that doesn't mean like you get a show. So if you think it's so great, like prove it. And so the book is me trying to prove it, and trying to do a very detailed dive into her psychology. She was a complicated person psychologically, into the context of the moment she lived, and then a lot of interpretation of the individual artworks and how we might make sense of them. And the book won a prize, and the prize meant that there was an interview and it was with the curator, Johanna Minnick, who's been a big champion of the work for a long time. And before I knew it, people were talking about exhibits, and the book had done its work, right? That now I was in a conversation with Sylvia Yount, the curator of the American Wing at the Met. So I went from here to here, and Sylvia's been this incredible partner. And, and before I knew it, the Met had decided to acquire some of these works and to put on Mary Sully Native Modern, which opened up last summer at the Met, and is now in a different version at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. And so I've become much more familiar with museums and the museum world, and it's just been this incredible, fantastic journey. I mean, I have to think, for me, it's got a lot of personal. I don't think I ever knew her. For a long time, I thought, well, I must have been in the same room with her. But, I'm talking with my mom. My mom said, well, I only met her 3 times. And I thought, okay, if my mom only met her 3 times, I probably did not meet her. But this sort of sense that this is a woman, and I think this is, again, one of these moments where history speaks to the present, right? This is a woman who made art, and a lot of it, right? These are quite intricate drawings. She was doing this for 15 years, maybe longer. When you think about 134 times 3, that's a lot of pencil and a lot of paper. So this is a great one. This is a music one called A Church Organist. And you can see, if you look at it closely, there's like little organ pipes, and then there are notes coming up, and then there's a kind of a church, and then there's the notes vibrating and bouncing around, and then it becomes a design pattern. She was very interested in trying to create commercial industrial design, and then it turns into this native pattern. right down at the bottom in the third panel. And that's the form. You have to see a lot of them together to see the form and understand that the form is an argument, really, for her. So, it's just been this incredible journey. I think of her, as an obscure artist who just made art for its own sake, for herself. I think a lot of this was therapeutic, sort of like just sitting and drawing quietly as a way of kind of dealing with the world. And this thing had sat on the brink of a trash can probably on at least 2 occasions. And it's really made me think, how many other artists are out there, right? Vernacular artists who make art because making art matters and is super important. And we all just kind of do it, and it doesn't even necessarily matter sometimes if anyone ever sees the art, like I write songs and record them and no one's ever going to hear them, right? Because it's just, I just do that stuff for me. And she was doing this stuff for her. So how many other artists from how many other communities are out there whose work actually made it into the trash can and we don't know about them? So I feel like it's a reclamation project for my great aunt, but also for all these other artists, and for Native women in particular, right? Who are oftentimes put in the category craft, when in fact, what they're doing is brilliant, artistic kinds of creative, sorts of work. So it's just been this it's the best project of my career. There's no doubt about it. And that's because the art is so amazing and so beautiful.
Do you think we're going to see it in DC? Do you think it'll come here?
I do think it's going to come here, and I can't say more about it, but
oh, that's so exciting.
It's not finalized, but yes, so what's been really fun is like there's 3 of them in a show right now at the Ford Foundation Gallery in New York called Reverberations, which is about sort of BIPOC, queer of color design. It's really a lovely show, and we feel, quite happy to have Mary Sully in there. It's going to be in a show that Jeffrey Gibson and Janelle Porter are curating at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in Boston. That'll open up in October, and she's paired with George Morrison, the Anishinaabe abstractionist, in a sort of a thread that's going to run through a set of galleries. And that show will travel, hint, hint. So, yes.
That's exciting.
So you've got our email addresses. So.
Yeah, I just want to point out that, like, one of the things I just love, I'm going to put up this picture of Mary and Ella, and they look like regular people.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, these are these, 2 sisters who basically, they never married. They traveled together. Oh, and there they are in their princessing, they're princessing, right? So these are the cultural politics, right? That they were code switching, right? In the sort of language that we would use today, right? Like, they know what a white audience wants and values. They're willing to give them that in, part, but it's not their whole kind of thing, right? They're doing it in order to actually make other kinds of their kinds of arguments. And then they're in their street clothes, right? Or their more formal clothes. I mean, so the 2 sisters traveled together. Ella was my other great aunt. And, she, quite an extraordinary thing. She worked for Franz Boas at Columbia. She crossed paths with Zora Neale Hurston. I kept looking for them to be having lunch together, but they, as far as I can tell, did not. But she's just to sort of pull one of the threads, and this is the cool thing about history, right? You pull a thread and you start to find all these other things, so she shows up with Franz Boas, this anthropologist at Columbia, who's working with a guy named Kleinberg, who's a social psychologist. And they've got this theory about sort of race and racial identities and intelligences. And they get this idea, like, let's develop an intelligence test, an African-American intelligence test, and let's give it to Indian people and white Appalachians and white urban dwellers. And let's develop an Indian intelligence test, and let's give it to the same kind of cohort, kind of a rural white and an urban white, an African-American and a Native American. And they're trying to think, like, are there particular forms of intelligence, right, that are attached to these racial kinds of groups? Now, Zora Neale Hurston is like, this is nuts, I'm leaving, right? And this is when she goes to New Orleans and she sort of leaves that whole world behind. But Kleinberg and Boas keep doing it. And actually, Ella develops an intelligence test that is based on Native American beadwork pattern, which is actually quite an interesting, I think, an appropriate way of sort of thinking about doing these things. Well, Kleinberg, he ends up being one of the lead sort of social psychologists who ends up testifying in the Brown v. Board cases that lead to educational desegregation, right? So here's a weird thread that you would never think is going to lead to a different kind of place, but in fact it does. And that's the super magical thing about history as well, is you just don't know what you're going to find, right? When you start following people, through the worlds in which they live, they do stuff that is interesting, and everything is a surprise, and it's fun, and cool to discover those things.
We have a comment from another historian, another Mennonite historian, Kim Schmidt, who says, this is another great thing about history, all these interesting rabbit holes we get to pursue. And, I think for people, the non-historians who are watching, like it is, I hope that this conversation is letting you see the excitement and the joy and the creativity that you learn when you start going down these paths. We have a lot of things that we do want to talk about with Mary Sully, but I am actually going to change the subject one more time. I'm a quick subject changer, so feel free to bring us back, Audrey or Tiana, if you want to. So we were backstage with Dr. Deloria, and I heard a little something about a meteor shower of 1833. Mm-hmm. And I am hoping that you can talk to us about that. What am I hearing, and why is this significant?
So on November 12th, 1833, this is one of those things that's like, why does this matter? But it turns out it's super interesting. It's super cool. So the Leonid meteor showers that happen every November, but happen in a very nice way every 33 years. There's a kind of a cycle. So in that night, there is between 20 and 40 meteors a second, right? That are coming out of the sky. So just like stop and wrap your head around that. Like, we go out to watch a meteor, you see one and you're like, damn, that was cool. Now imagine 20 a second, and 20 in the next second, and in the next second. And some of them leave them behind these long vapor trails, and some of them have sounds attached to them. So this was this incredible freak out moment. Like everybody thought the world was ending, because like who sees this kind of thing? Like it was being in a snow globe, right? So that's one cool thing about it. Second cool thing about it, it was visible across the entire continent. So everybody could see it, right? And everybody woke up their neighbors and their friends, and everybody ran outside. So it's this interesting shared experience of the many diverse people on the continent at that time. And they're all having different kinds of experiences. So I've kind of put them in these two buckets, like people who think it is a sign to be interpreted, people think it's a phenomenon to be explained, right? And so you've got a sort of scientific mindset and a kind of metaphysical mindset. But part of the argument of the book is that the project is that like these things are actually really mixed up. They're completely confused. The scientists start sounding like they're ministers, and the ministers start sounding, are engaged in sort of scientific kinds of things. So, so I'm looking at Native American people in the Southern Plains in particular, who've confronted these incredible epistemological crises of their own, right? That there are ample reason to think that this is another sign of the world ending. I'm looking at scientists, particularly this guy in New Haven, Denison Olmsted, who basically invents meteor science out of this moment, right? Even as astronomers kind of knew what was going on here, but most people didn't, and most people thought in old Aristotelian terms, which is, well, there's a dome of the sky. Like this is how the weirdness of the people of the past. There's a dome of the sky, and we got to make room for heaven. Heaven's on the other side of the dome. The dome is maybe 4 or 5 rifle shots above us. It's very close. So the stars, right, are small things that are close to us rather than large things that are far away from us, right? So there's this, and what's causing these things? Vapors rising from the ground and hitting electrical charges at the top of the dome, right? This is the kind of classic explanation. So Denison Olmsted actually figures out that these are attached to comets, and it's a really neat moment in thinking about American science. And then also thinking a bit about sort of the dynamics of enslavers and enslaved people in the South, because one of the things that happens that's really interesting is there's a lot of these moments where it's quite clear that enslavers, despite the ways in which they're mobilizing the Bible to sort of justify, have a kind of awareness that what they're doing is, by sort of Christian epistemological standards, a sin, right? And so there's this moment when the meteors fall, when these sort of slave owners will run out and say, like, I'm going to tell you where I sold your people, right? I'm going to, and they confess their fear, and they fall to the ground like everyone else. And it's a moment, right, that when the next day happens and the world has not ended, there's this struggle over memory and narrative. And you get white slave owners saying something like, 600 people from 3 plantations came crawling to us, begging us to save them. When in fact, what enslaved people are able to remember is like, no. You ran out of the house in your undershirt and crawled under the house with the rest of us. You were terrified, right? You were confessing the fact that you understand this to be a sin. And it's this kind of moment of clarity, I think, that ends in 100-year-long contest over memory, right? So I end up, it's a different way of using the WPA slave narratives that are sort of captured in the 1930s. Not necessarily as sort of accurate renditions of life, although that's part of that, but about sort of the ways in which memory is sort of imagined, and constructed. And then there's a whole last bit of this. There's a whole set of millennialists who believe that the world is going to end in 1843, and all of a sudden the stars are falling in 1833. So how do they make sense of that, right? And that produces things like the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So there's these long kind of connections and histories over time. And then just one last little piece of this. The meteor shower in 1966 is apparently as great as the meteor shower in 1833. But how many of us have any memory of this at all? Like, no one does, And it's a moment, therefore, where like the explanations, the people's understandings of astronomy, are quite different. And so 1833 ends up being this revelatory moment. And when you think about 1833 in relation to today, to go back to the earlier question, how does the past give us leverage on the present? Well, it's not by coincidence that our current president likes to have Andrew Jackson's portrait in the White House. And Andrew Jackson was the guy who was president. He was the guy who was sort of pushing back against sort of, he wanted to have a more absolutist kind of, understanding of what the executive branch, was able to do. Economic crisis, right? They were just recovering from one in the teens, and they were about to head into the great one of 1837. Unpredictability of knowledge, right? New mass media and technology through STEAM. Like when you think about like what the 1830s look like, they look a lot like a version of our present, but they're not, right? And so going back and figuring out how people were thinking about those things in that moment is a way to get some leverage on where we're at in the present moment. So even though it's an old history, I think it's a history that has a lot of relevance to today. Super fun project.
So 1833, 1966. So that sounds like 2099. Am I doing my math right?
I think the next big one is scheduled for 32. There's a little bit of play in the system, right? I mean, because it's, the comet comes around every 33 years, right? But a lot of times it's the dust trail that's left behind in a previous orbit that actually creates the meteor showers, right? And so every time the comet comes around, it's leaving behind a new dust trail. So it's kind of interesting to see sort of like how it happens. But yes, every 33 years, we pass through the dust trails of the old stuff in one form or another.
Do we have time for one more, do you think, Kylie?
Yeah, I think you can do one more.
Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and throw caution to the wind. We're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the country. During the bicentennial, 1976, just 1 year before my time, Native Americans were actively fighting for self-determination, demanding government honor treaties, addressing historical injustices. What topics and issues and causes related to Native Americans and Indigenous peoples and nations experience in and with the American nation can we champion or amplify in our 250th celebration?
Yeah. Wow. Well, I think, for me, the fundamental thing for us to be thinking about now and into the future is the treaty relationship, the nation-to-nation relationship, the fact that Native people are a political group, in addition to being racialized, right? But they're not a racial group in the same sort of way that other groups are, right? Native peoples have treaty relationships with the United States government. So it's a nation-to-nation kind of relationship, described as domestic dependent nationhoods. It's qualified in these different kinds of ways. But, that treaty relationship is really, really critical. And you can already see the ways in which it's being attacked, both in the administrative sort of sense of like, well, we've got an obligation to Native people that's taken shape through the Indian Health Service. Well, what happens when we start cutting positions in the Indian Health Service, right? We're not upholding those treaty obligations. But there's also this sense in which the 14th Amendment, this is why it's useful to go back and study the past, right? This thing about birthright citizenship, which is very much about getting rid of people who are here in the United States, right, in the present, questioning the status of citizens. We have to understand that past in order to make sense of it. Well, the 14th Amendment carves out the same thing that we find in the 3/5 clause of the Constitution, right? So if we remember the 3/5 clause, it's a math problem. We've got the American citizen, right, which is the classic white American man, right? Women are actually not included in this kind of thing. We've got the white American citizen. We've got those bound to a term of service for a certain number of years, the indentured servant, who will now enter that status. They're a plus. We have the minus sign, Indians not taxed. And then we have that thing which could not be said, right, in the Constitution, slavery, 3/5 of all other persons, right, the compromise that allows North and South to actually set up a governing structure. You go to the 14th Amendment, and what you find is Indians not taxed is still there. They are still excluded. They're written into the Constitution to be out of the Constitution. And that is the important fact, the baseline fact, right, that Indian nationhood, political status, right, is just absolutely key. And, what we have to be on guard against is the use of the 14th Amendment in this case around, equality of the law and due process, right? To sort of say Indians are just another racial group who have had special rights, and we're going to get rid of those special rights. This is the discourse that people would like to sort of have us think about as true, and it's not true. It's just not true. So I think the thing that we can all do is sort of zealously guard against that and sort of just recognize Indian nationhood and sovereignty. And that means a consultation relationship with tribes. That's what we really need to be thinking about going forward.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Dr. Deloria, it has been a tremendous honor to have you with us. We're so appreciative of all of your work, the stories you shine light on, and the time that you spent with us today. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much. For those of you watching at home or later, one of the best ways to support our guests, like Dr. Deloria, is to read their books. So you can get Dr. Deloria's books from your favorite independent bookstore. We do have some of his works in our library, but there's also a lot of libraries around us that have these books as well. We definitely recommend Becoming Mary Sully. Just gorgeous. If you're not in a position to buy right now, again, ask your library to see if they'll buy it. You never know. His work is incredible. If you're in Minneapolis right now, or you're going to go between now and September, try to get to the Institute of Art to see Mary Sully's work in person. And we're hoping that maybe you might come back and visit us when she comes to DC in whatever form that might be. We have lots of other great things coming up for you. Monday evening, we have a virtual event with Kevin Nguyen about his incredible, I guess this is next Monday because this is not this Monday, his incredibly timed new book, My Documents, on Tuesday with our Lunch and Learn, and then V. Castro in conversation about Queen of the Cicadas. Tuesday evening, our Solidarity Stories book group continues at Mixed Food Hall as we talk about, help me, please. Layla Lalami's The Other Americans. To learn more about those and all the other things we have coming up, please visit the Office of Human Rights at civilrights.mypgc.us and the library at pgc.info/events. Thank you all for being with us. You are why we do what we do. Dr. Deloria, again, thank you so much. And we will all see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.